I want to give a big thank you to all my patrons, and I'll be doing a Kingsguard roll call after today's video.
Welcome back to the Fantasy Network, everyone. My name is, of course, Jimmy Nuts, and today we are going to be reviewing and ranking the stories that come within this wonderful collection called Stories of Your Life and Others by Ted Chiang. I like short fiction. It's not something that I am like a super connoisseur of. I'm not an expert by any means, but at 280 pages, this has to be one of the best deals in literature. I really mean that. I think pound for pound that this book is stacked with some of the more human things I've read, but also some of the coolest ideas that I have read. And when we talk about science fiction, or even speculative fiction in general, one thing I've heard time and time again, this is something Stephen Erickson actually told me whenever we were discussing reading. He was saying that nowadays he actually kind of gravitates a little bit more towards sci-fi. And whenever I asked him this, he said something that has stuck with me. And I don't think he's the first person ever to say it. I think it maybe isn't just a well-known fact, but I hadn't heard it before. And that is that science fiction is the genre of ideas. And there is not a better example than this in these short stories. What is accomplished over sometimes just 11 pages or upwards of like 60 on some of the longer short stories in this book are just astounding. And when it comes to sci-fi, there's generally two camps of ideas that I've come across, at least. And again, I'm not an expert, but it seems like a lot of speculative ideas that are very broad will make you start to formulate questions, not give you an answer either way, but they don't get into the nitty-gritty details. And then there's hard sci-fi, right? That does get into the nitty-gritty details and is not afraid to pull back the veil and give you all of the proofs for their ideas or the science behind it or the math. The interesting thing about these short stories and this collection by Ted Chiang is the fact that it is a mix of both, where rationalism and humanity come together as one, where there are actual empirical evidence in the book for some of the ideas and for the stories. I would be lying to you if I told you that sometimes the details and the information wasn't just a wee bit overwhelming and a little bit over my head. But the glorious thing is, every single time it felt like it was approaching that stage, it was always pulled back and then connected to humanity. And I think that the amazing ideas that are explored in these short stories all end with the question of, well, how does that impact the human race? And without the human race, you could argue that there's no consciousness to experience these things, at least as far as we know. So I think that's a really important bridge between those two camps, and this book does it absolutely wonderfully. And listen, if you're a science or math nerd, and I know Bookborn was a big supporter of this, and I had a lot of patrons tell me that I should read this, that I would enjoy it. And Bookborn is a math nerd for those who do not know, and I would also say probably a science nerd. If you fall into that camp, I think you're going to have a ball with this. I definitely enjoy science. I was in physics in college, didn't graduate because I'm a failure. However, I still enjoy that. A lot of the YouTube content I actually ingest, my daily reading outside of fiction is mostly physics and history too. But I still like physics. I still like science. I like that nerdy stuff. And there's a lot in here that is good. It's good science. But it also doesn't feel wildly detailed to the point where I was falling asleep, right? It had never happened in any of these stories. And one thing Bookborn told me that has really resonated with me, and I feel the same way when it comes to rating a short story collection. How do you rate an overall collection? Well, you probably shouldn't give it 5 stars unless you enjoyed every single story. Bookborn said that. I think it resonates very well for me. And I have to say, this is a 5-star read for me. There was not a single story in this book or collection or whatever we want to call it that I didn't at least enjoy. Some of them are borderline just ideas. There's actually a story in here that doesn't really contain characters, which is interesting. And then there's also stuff that isn't just futuristic or scientific, really. It's stuff from the time of the Tower of Babel, which is a story from the Bible, which I think is very fascinating. And that's in here. So I don't want people to come into this and think, okay, there's only like math and physics and that's all this is. No, there's a large array of stories here that inspect history, that inspect the human condition, what it means to actually be a human, maybe into the future, and also the hit sci-fi movie Arrival, which I loved. The short story for that is actually in here and what inspired it, which I think is a pretty good indicator of how much of a genius Ted Chiang is. And I hate to use that term and throw it around but I think it really qualifies here. I think it's appropriate to say that Ted Chiang is a genius, because whenever you have that technical wherewithal, but also, the empathy and the inspection on the human condition to write something that has emotional ties while still being sound technically, you're just not seeing that all the time, right? At least I haven't. And obviously the reception for this has been, everyone that I think I know that has read this has said it was amazing. But also, if you just look at the critical reception for this, it's through the roof. I mean, Arrival was a big budget movie and a massive hit. And it's no surprise. I think that there's a lot of quality ideas coming out of Ted Chiang's head, and I'm saying the word ideas entirely too often. So now to get into what some of these stories are actually about, I'm going to talk about them from my least favorite to my favorite, and that is how you'll know that they're ranked. I believe there's 8 stories in here. I'll have to double check my list, but I am going to go through each one. I am going to talk about what they're about. So if you're someone that likes to go into a book completely blind, you probably don't want to watch this next section of the video, but I'm not going to give away any spoilers on how things end. And I would actually say that even knowing the premise of these stories is not that big of a deal, because it's really about what happens in your brain after you read these. All I wanted to do was talk about these short stories, and me and Bookborn talked at length in messages, just back and forth, about how amazing some of these are, how it landed with us. This is a book that can spark a lot of conversation, which I hope to have down in the comments if you've read this book before. But without any further ado, let's kind of get into my rankings / thoughts on all of the stories that are included in this collection. So coming in at number 8 was the short story Evolution of Human Science, and this is the story I was talking about that doesn't really have any characters, but the whole idea behind this is, what does it mean to be human going into the future? There are humans, and then these almost meta-humans, I believe is the phrase that's used, and science is now trying to figure out a way for us normal people to communicate with these kind of just super intelligent meta-humans that have kind of created their own culture and they're almost like their own totally different species at this point. And it's examining what science becomes if something like that were to exist in the future, if humanity was to split into 2 different camps like that. As we get more technologically advanced, do we start altering what it means to be human? And that's all I can say. It's a relatively short one, and I did enjoy it. So even though it's number 8, I liked it. I think there's a pretty good conversation to be had there. This is one that if I ever did a stream talking about these stories, this is what I could see spending a lot of time on. Number 7 is a short story called 72 Letters. And this was probably, in my opinion, the weirdest story out of the bunch, and I think I would need to read it again to really have a great grasp on everything that was happening. But essentially, it's an alternative history where you can speak names into things and kind of bring them to life. I believe they're called golems is what they're referred to in the story. Again, this one was very odd, but it also then looks at how humans are kind of going to die out in the evolutionary cycle in a certain amount of years, and what can they do to continue the human race. As you can see, again, a lot of really interesting concepts that always relay back to humans and how we react. So I thought this was interesting. The reason why it's ranked so low is because, to be honest with you, it took me about half the story just to figure out that, okay, they're actually bringing inanimate objects to life, it seems, which is a little bit bizarre. This is one I would really like to see adapted, especially since, Arrival's taken from one of the stories here. This could be one I think on screen with visuals could be really enticing and compelling. Number 6 is The Tower of Babylon. I briefly mentioned it earlier, and this one's pretty self-explanatory. It's about the Tower of Babylon, and it is kind of back in biblical times, and it's someone who is going to be working on the tower and getting to the very top where they're about to reach heaven, and what happens when you cross that plane. And this story I thought would be my favorite, literally just reading it, because even though myself I am not really religious, I think the Bible is a fascinating piece of written work, and I'm very interested in a lot of the stories that come into that. So the Tower of Babylon I think is very fascinating, and I expected to like this a little bit more, but there wasn't enough else going on. If that makes sense. I wish that, I honestly could probably just read an entire novel about it and that would be great. And I still enjoyed this story, but what really brings it together, I did feel like it was a little bit mundane going through it, but the end of this short story is awesome. It's so good, and it saved it for me. Otherwise, this might have been one of the stories that I didn't like, but I liked it so much that I actually jumped these other two that I enjoyed and landed it at number 6. I would say it's relatively straightforward with a very open-ended, pondering type ending for you, and I think you'll enjoy it. Number 5 is one, I believe Bookborn might be her favorite. I can't really remember, but she's a big math nerd, so we talked about it a lot. But Division by Zero, which is essentially, I believe her name was Renee, and she's a great mathematician, and she is going through these mathematical proofs and realizes that arithmetic is inconsistent and doesn't really make any sense, and it basically drives her mad, and then she has a husband. There's a lot of mental turmoil here, and I think it's largely about, well, what if someone were able to prove these things in mathematics, but it's way more about mental illness. And this story was one that got into the weeds, right? I was a little lost. I'm not the best math student. I know some of you aren't, so you're going to relate with that. But the human side of this equation was outstanding, and about the relationship that she's in, and she's going through all this anguish and how that impacts someone. And what do we look like? Or how do we look upon someone that is going through mental turmoil? Also, to be obsessed with something, which is something that I feel like I can relate because I have a very obsessive personality. So there's a lot to relate to here, and I think that there's a lot more of a meaning to this other than just dividing or having division by zero. So now we're entering the top 4, and I gotta tell you, these are all certified bangers. Like, I loved all 4 of these so very much. And number 4 is the story Understand, which honestly, all I gotta say is if you've ever seen the show or heard about the show Limitless, the idea that, you're unlocking all this potential in your mind and you're becoming this hyper-intelligent being, that's what this is about. It's about a man who had some brain damage and nearly drowned. His brain, he couldn't remember things, so they're giving him this experimental drug, and it turns out it's actually like unlocking more potential in his brain. I love that concept. I'm here for it any day of the week. It is a sci-fi trope that I will always be interested in. And this is my favorite execution of that trope here. And number 3 I thought was going to be number 1, and it's Story of Your Life, which is the short story that inspired the film Arrival, which I just adored. And the short story is just as good. I mean, I think the film gets a lot more breadth, so it gets to kind of iron out a lot of the side stuff. So the movie is just excellent. But the short story that's inspired here, and the core idea that we have first contact with aliens and that we send someone out that does, that is trying to speak their language and start to communicate with them, and then how does the government involve in that? And I mean, it's just an awesome premise. I love First Contact. I'm all about it. But the short story, it's amazing. The film that was birthed out of this idea is so impressive, and the short story is well worth your time. I would say this is probably the one that's going to resonate with the biggest audience, even though I picked 2 to be ranked above it, and it's my number 3. I imagine a lot of people's favorite Ted Chiang story is this, Story of Your Life. Number 2, which is so razor close to being number 1, but didn't quite make it there, and it's my runner-up for my favorite story of this collection, and that is Hell is the Absence of God. And whether you are religious or you're not, it doesn't matter. This story was captivating and has a lot of questions about what if God's actions really were so random that you could never understand, that he's on such a different plane that the things that happen make no sense, and that it just doesn't seem to have any kind of human rational thought behind it, right? So when we ask about the terrible things that happen in the world and we say, well, there's a plan, it's like asking, okay, well, what is that plan when we're actually seeing acts of God happen, and some people are being blessed in the vicinity that may not even really deserve it in our standards, but other people's lives are being ruined by literal acts of God's and like angels appearing, and it creates this catastrophe every time it happens. Some people get blessed, some people's lives are ruined forever. Oh, it ponders a lot of huge questions and what you might believe, and what it would it mean if there really is a God out there, and how do you justify what seems unjustifiable? Oh, this is so good. And I have just pondered this story probably more than any of the other ones, possibly, maybe. I don't know. They're all so good. But this one was great. And number 1 is Liking What You See, a documentary. It is a short story that's actually written like a documentary. And it's not jarring at all. I could see this being a mock documentary on like Netflix or something. And I hope they do it. That would be great. But essentially, it's the idea that some people can grow up with this thing in their brain where they can't actually perceive beauty. So that means that there is no biases socially, like, for instance, like if you wanted to go into a job interview and you don't get the job and you feel like it's because maybe you had facial reconstructive surgery from some accident or something like that and you feel like people are judging you. Well, if you choose to undergo this operation, then you cannot perceive any beauty, right, in the face, strictly in the facial features. And there's like a community that has tried this out, and they're seeing that their kids are like a lot more empathetic, and they see violence go down, bullying in schools go down, and now they're trying to implement it at a campus. And there are people who are for it, and people who are against it, saying beauty is part of my right as being a human to judge you for that. And some people say, you know what, this would just make everything a lot more even. It's fascinating. And there's multiple perspectives, like there's different featured people and characters in the documentary, and some are for it, some are against it, some start flipping their mind, and then you see what it kind of cultivates, as it ends up, is a little bit open-ended, but there are some major consequences, I guess, to this being implemented or the way it's voted on and stuff on the college campus. I think this is my favorite story because it feels almost so relevant to today and events that are happening. You can draw a lot of parallels with it. So I felt like it spoke to me the most. It also happens to be the last short story in the collection. So for it to go out with a bang like this was just absolutely fantastic. Really interesting premise, and I think it could also spark a lot of conversation. I keep saying that, but that's kind of what this book is, and that's why I really believe it's pound for pound, one of the best books I own because of how much conversation and ideas and pondering you can get. I've been saying pondering and ideas a lot. I'm sorry. I'm running out of words, I guess. But you can get a lot out of this book. And I love it. It was awesome. I give this a 5-star collection, and none of these stories were unenjoyable. I enjoyed all of them, even whenever it was getting into the nitty-gritty details that I'm too dumb to understand. I always felt like it was pulled back into a more human way that I could connect with. And that is the kind of sci-fi that I absolutely love. If you've read this or you plan on reading it, drop down in the comments and let me know. I've heard Exaltation, his second collection, is even better. Like unanimously, I've heard that. That's wild to me, and this is going to be something that I dive into very soon, I hope. Ted Chiang is probably one of the most talented authors I've ever read in my entire life, and I really mean that. I hope he continues to write, and I will continue to read them. If you like this video, think about hitting like on the video and subscribe. I'd love to have you here on the channel. I'm always posting book reviews and doing bookish-type podcast and content all the time, and I just love to have you to be a part of the community. There is a Patreon in the description. It's optional, but always appreciated. Until I see you next time, be good, be safe. Remember to always keep turning the page.
I want to give another big shout out to all my patrons, especially my Kingsguard, which include Henrik, Brendan, Nick, Oscar, Stuart, Josephine, Ikaika, Amanda, RJ, Shad, Nicoletta, Tanner, Jennifer, Frank, Jay, Sarah, Pat, Kevin, Ryan, Michael, Terrence, Wade, Darren, FM, Derry, Boss, Mitch, Sebastian, Benjamin, and Jobot. Thank you all so much. You're the best.